Welcome to AI Goes to College, the podcast that helps higher education professionals navigate the changes brought on by generative AI. I'm Dr. Craig Van Slyke, and I host the podcast along with friend, colleague, and co-host Dr. Robert E. Crossler. Combined, Rob and I have over 40 years of experience in higher education, serving in roles ranging from adjunct faculty to dean. We're here to help you figure out what in the world's going on with generative AI and, more importantly, what you can do about it. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of AI Goes to College. My friend, colleague, and co-host Robert E. Crossler, better known as Rob, is here joining me once again. Today, we've got three things to talk about, and so let's just get right to it. The first is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and this gets into the conversation that we've had previously about trying to figure out when students are cheating with generative AI. And one conclusion we've kind of come to is that it's really hard to tell with certainty. You know, you can kind of tell, but it's really hard to prove. That's a whole different topic. But I think one thing we might think about as faculty members and as administrators, if you have contact with students, is how to help students think about all of this differently. So the kind of overarching message that I would send to students is that if you're cheating with generative AI or really anything else, you're cheating your learning. You're short-circuiting your learning. Now, Rob, have you ever said that to students? You know, you're just cheating yourself or your kids?
Absolutely. They roll their eyes and they're like, whatever, Dad.
Yeah. Yep. So, I will recognize right up front that this is a little bit of a challenge, but I do think we need to help students understand this because it's going to really harm them if we don't help them understand this. So just because it's not easy doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And so kind of here's my flow of argument, and then Rob, you can tell me where I'm wrong. So we have we know that cheating, academic dishonesty hurts students in the long run. You know, if they go on Chegg or, you know, buy an essay from somebody, they cheat themselves. I mean, hopefully. I think there's an assumption there that there's learning value in the activity, but we'll just make that assumption. In traditional modes, we have ways to try to kind of catch that. You know, we have things like Turnitin. You know, we kind of know what canned answers are for some of our assignments. And so we have some ways to prevent or at least detect that sort of cheating. Generative AI is a whole different ballgame. We don't really have good ways to detect it. Students don't know where the lines are. We've talked about this before. If they copy something from the web and paste it into an essay, most of them know that's wrong. But how far is too far with generative AI? And so I think one of the things we can do is try to get students to take the long-term view. You know, if you don't put the work into learning, you're not going to learn. And at some point in the future, that could well come back to bite you. So that's kind of my general thesis. But there are a couple of problems with that. One is that we focus on short-term goals. You know, grades on assignments, grades on papers. You know, those are short-term things, and we set up the incentive systems to where maybe we evaluate learning, but mostly we evaluate whether or not students have done an assignment. You know, hopefully we catch the learning with that as well. But because we focus on short-term goals like grades, students focus on short-term activities. And we kind of embed short-term thinking in them. Then there's a second problem that's a little bit harder to describe, and it's hyperbolic discounting, which is just a fun thing to say. people tend to prefer small, immediate rewards over larger future rewards. And we see that in all kinds of things. Rob and I both do research in privacy and security. You see that with security and privacy behaviors. And I think that this is a big problem with students. I know if I get ChatGPT to do the answer, I've saved myself 30 minutes of work or whatever it is. Is that going to hurt me in the future? I don't know. That's way off in the future. And especially when you're young, that's a pretty common way of thinking. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter. What do you think,
So
Rob?
I don't disagree. I think these are issues, but I don't know if they're the students' issues or if they're the faculty members' issues. Because a lot of how students respond is based on what's being asked of them by faculty. And so if I give a lot of little assignments that have grades attached to them, and that's a good portion of your score in a class, from back to even when we were undergraduates, we oftentimes took the path of least resistance to get whatever needed to be done. And one of the thoughts I've been toying with is, if I'm teaching in a world of generative AI and I want students to be learning how to use these technologies because it's a tool that's going to be available to them in the workplace, what is it that I really want to measure that shows me they've learned something? And how can I basically bake the points into a class in a way to where they demonstrate that they have learned what they need to learn, so that even if they're using these tools along the way, it's been part of the learning process, ultimately leading to the end goal of what I expect at the end of the semester.
I think you're on to something important there. One of the things that we as faculty kind of got nudged into over the last decade or so is this idea of learning being facilitated by a large number of low stakes activities. So instead of just having a couple of big tests or one big paper or something like that, you have a lot of these little activities, and you encourage students to experiment, and they don't get as stressed out because if you blow one thing, it's not that big a deal. I don't know. Have you sensed that as well, that we've kind of been nudged in that direction?
I absolutely have, and I've read some things that one of the struggles faculty are going to have is, do they teach in a way that makes students happy with how much they feel like they're getting feedback along the way, and with the number of measurement points along the way, or do they find ways to teach their classes in a method that's the best way to get to the end goals? And if those two things don't align, how do you wrestle with that tension?
Yeah. Well, that's always a problem, right? This idea of trying to align the learning with student evaluations, basically.
Well, I read
that's a whole different topic.
I read a paper just last week written by Harvard Business Review, I believe, that was comparing an active learning classroom environment to a lecture environment. And at the end, based on learning outcomes that they assessed, students learned more through being in an active learning classroom. But if you ask students where they thought they learned more, they felt like they learned more from a traditional lecture system. And so if you're basing how you teach on what the students think is that space where they're learning more, you may actually be shortchanging them what they would actually learn.
You also get into a problem with active learning sometimes where the students don't understand how much expertise and work it requires to be successful with active learning. And I didn't say that very well, but it's a lot easier to get up and lecture than it is to teach through active learning. But students see it as the exact opposite way. Well, I don't see all the PowerPoints, and, he doesn't really do anything, or she doesn't really do anything. We do all the work. And first of all, it's like, yes, it's you that's learning. You're supposed to be doing the work. But that causes huge problems when it comes to evaluations. But I want to kind of go back to the generative AI piece. One thing that you were talking about made me think that maybe what we need to do is separate out the learning the feedback, and the grade. So there are three things. You've got the activity, which is where the learning occurs in combination with the feedback. The grade is merely an incentive. So if it's the incentive that's making them use generative AI inappropriately, then maybe what we need to do is rethink the incentives. That's kind of my big point with this part of the discussion.
Yeah, and that's the thing I've been wrestling with is what does that look like, a restructuring of the class. And I'll give you one example of something I've thought about. And I took a class as an undergraduate from a professor that gave us two exams all semester long. We had a midterm and we had a final. And in his world, he said, I'd love to do a European model. And what he told us, and I'm not sure if this is perfectly accurate, but you take one exam at the end of the semester and that's what it is. But in his view, it was better that or not his view, in the university's view, they expected him to have something to assign a midterm grade. Therefore, we had to have a midterm exam prior to the midterm grade being posted, and then we had the final exam. And so you had two exams, each were 50% of your grade, and that was it in this class. If you didn't do the activities along the way, if you didn't show up to class, you didn't engage, you weren't going to do well on the exams. And it was stressful. I didn't love that as a student, but as I reflect on that now, if you do a lot of purposeful things in the classroom and activities along the way that help students learn, and then that is reflected on their performance of a measurable at the end of the semester, does that get us to this place where we know that students have accomplished what they need to in the classroom?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was kind of the norm when I was an undergrad. Of course, I'm old, but you had a midterm and a final. You might have some homework along the way. You might have some attendance points, but basically you had two big things and that was it. Maybe three. So I don't think we're going to solve this particular problem today, but I do want to plant the seed that we've come up with about rethinking this lots of graded activities. And maybe there's a different model out there. And we're not going to get it right the first time. So we need to be willing to experiment a little bit. And administrators who are listening, one of our running themes is don't punish smart experiments. If a faculty member tries something and it doesn't quite work out and her or his evaluations suffer a bit, if you as an administrator punish them because of that, then you're going to get them going back to the easy way. So that's not what we want. But I want to go back to the idea of mind shift. I think we need to be really consistent and firm and highly repetitive to the point of maybe irritating students about the necessity for them to take the long-term view of their learning. I think we just need to hit that over and over and over and over again, coupled with explaining to students how what we're asking them to do connects to their learning. I think that's a big missing piece because it's obvious to us. When we created the activity, we had a model in our mind of why this was going to help them learn. It is not obvious to students. And I think we need to communicate that more clearly. So those are the big things I think we can do in the short term. Well, not really in the short term, but we can get started on in the short term that could pay off for some students.
Yep, absolutely agree. And I think anything moving in that direction is better than nothing.
Yeah. Yep. If we couple that with clarifying what's okay and what's not okay for AI use, I think we can maybe make some progress. But it's going to take some time. I think we just need to be honest with ourselves that it is going to take some time to get where we need to get. I think I'm going to throw one more thing out there, and this may end up getting cut. We'll see. I also start to wonder if we're not trying to pack too much into our courses. For those of you who don't know, Rob and I co-author a pretty widely used Introduction to Information Systems textbook with Franz Boulanger of Virginia Tech. And we've just come out with a new edition, the 5th edition. It's available from Prospect Press, by the way, if you're interested. But every new edition, we get pushed to put more and more and more in the book. And I think there's a tendency to do that in our classes as well. We're going to add a topic, add a topic, add a topic. And sometimes I wonder if it makes any difference if students learn that stuff at all.
Well, that reminds me of a conversation I've had, Craig, with faculty members who, as we've talked about bringing AI into the classroom, and one of the responses I get is, I still have to cover all of this stuff, and if I move down this road of a highly engaging active learning activity, what is it that I remove from the classroom? And I think there's some tensions there of, what is the way I've always done things the best way? Are the topics I've always covered the best topics to continue covering? And how can you step back and say at the end, I want them to know X, Y, and Z? Are the activities, are the things I'm asking students to do an adequate pathway so they can demonstrate that they've learned X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. And as X, Y, and Z gets to be a bigger and bigger and bigger set, they're going to retain less and less and less of it. So I've been toying with this idea of the lean course for a number of years and I've never really done anything with it. But I think a lot of courses, there's a handful of things that you really want them to know 6 months after the course. Like in database, I taught database design and administration for a number of years. I wanted them to know 3 things. That was it. The rest of it I wanted them to kind of be aware of, but I didn't care if they really remembered any of it 6 months after the course was over. So that might be something to think about as well. And then you can really focus on the learning that's important.
Well, and Craig, I think a useful tool there is Bloom's taxonomy. If what you're focusing on is the base of that pyramid, which is to understand and to remember the 2 base layers of Bloom's taxonomy, that's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. But if you move up to the top of Bloom's taxonomy to issues like having them create, having students be able to evaluate, having students be able to analyze, maybe even apply, I think you reduce the amount of things that students have to be able to do to succeed in the class. And then our measurement is based on, there are tools that are going to help us remember stuff, right? The internet's getting better and better at providing the remember portion. But being able to create something, we're not creating more and different things in a database class, though there may be more stuff they have to remember and understand. So how do we change our focus as faculty to ask the more challenging aspects of students of being able to create things?
Yeah. And if you think back on your own experiences as a student, and I think you probably remember the classes where they focused on helping you gain those higher levels of knowledge and skills, and not the ones where you had to memorize, 900 things for the midterm.
Absolutely.
So. All right, I think it's time to move on to topic number 2. Claude 3.5 Sonnet came out in the last couple of weeks, and it is awesome, I think. My use of it, it's been really fast. I mean, really fast. I tried some kind of A/B testing where I ran the same prompt through 3.5 Sonnet and through 3.0 Opus, which is the big dog model for Anthropic. And Sonnet was at least as good in its response, and it was probably 5 times as fast. Now, it still can't go out and surf the web, I don't think, which I don't know that any of the Claude models can, which is a little bit of a problem, a big problem for some applications. But if people in the audience, if you haven't tried 3.5 Sonnet, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, you should. And I think it is available for free. It's one of the free models that you can use. So have you had a chance to play around with it?
I haven't played with it personally, but I have read a lot of reviews on it, and I'm seeing the exact same things. Almost to the point where people are saying the sky is falling, this is going to change the world, which I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. I think learning to use these tools and the process of creation is going to make people highly efficient in what they do. But yeah, it's been impressive.
What I wonder about with that change the world bit is how they're getting it to be so fast. because that could make significant changes in what these tools are capable of in terms of use cases. But I also wonder if they figured out a way to make all of it much more efficient computationally. And if they have, that's a huge deal. I have not dug into it enough to know if that's the case, but it seems to me if it's faster, there's some efficiency being gained in there somewhere. Although, that the tech behind it is well beyond my capability to understand.
Craig, you've been around long enough to know about Moore's Law and see Moore's Law play itself out in the world of computers.
Was that an age dig?
Right? Maybe.
Maybe a small one.
But with Moore's Law, right, with the processing speed would double every, 1.5 years? Was that about the rule of thumb with Moore's Law?
Yeah, not exactly. That's not exactly what, but that's close enough.
And
yeah.
I watch what's going on in this space with Claude 3.5 and how much better it is than the previous version. And then what's next, right? It feels like next week somebody else is going to come up with something else that is even better. At what point do we hit the limits of what technology can do to make things better and faster? And are we going to keep up at the speed of what we've been seeing over the last year?
I think Moore's Law was at its core, it's a physical thing, not just conceptual rule or law or guideline, whatever you want to call it. I think we could hit some limits with generative AI that are based on the capability of some of the underlying GPUs and that kind of thing. But what I think might keep the advances pushing further are things involved in the interface, the way guardrails are implemented. Those kinds of things we could be improving pretty rapidly for quite a while. But the real answer is who knows? I mean, I don't think anybody really knows. But it's going to be fun to sit back and watch. It's also going to be nonlinear. Every time one of these new models comes out, it's really good, and then something changes, and it gets a little bit worse, and then it gets better again. And so it's not going to be this linear, upward trend. It's going to be a little sawtooth, but generally heading up. But I was shocked by how much better 3.5 was. I mean, it makes me think, what is 4 going to be like?
Right. And I had a conversation with one of my faculty members who teaches a programming class, and seeing what Claude can do by just taking a picture and say, make this into a Python program that does everything I want it to do. And it was pretty darn good. What does that mean for the class where you're trying to teach students to program? And there's some challenges there that I don't know the answer to. And I think it's going to be interesting from an educator's perspective of how you handle some of these advances that are occurring.
Especially for any course in which you create artifacts that generative AI can create. Whether it's written material, whether it's code, whether it's design, we're going to have to rethink those. And the mantra that I keep hitting is moving humans up the stack. So maybe we don't need to spend as much time on how to code. We spend time on engineering, on how to interact with users, how to assess the quality of the design.
Yeah, and how to take a business problem and ultimately figure out what is it that needs to be written in code, which, as I think of the world of information systems, which is where I spend a lot of my time thinking, that's what our students hopefully are being trained how to do. And the writing code piece is understanding what's happening once you've identified those business problems.
Well, and I feel like I've said this before, so I apologize if that's the case. But, back in the day, if you wrote assembler, you were a wimp. And then higher level languages came out and, the assembler people looked down on it. But, why do all that assembly if you can do it in COBOL or Fortran? And so I just wonder if this is another step along that natural progression where we don't have to spend as much time worrying about the guts. We worry more about kind of how it's applied. But we'll see. I mean, again, here's our mantra for this episode. Who knows? I mean, really, who knows? But I mentioned artifacts. There are two things that came out of this from Anthropic, who, by the way, Anthropic is who produces Claude, kind of like OpenAI produces ChatGPT. So that's who Anthropic is. They also came out with something called artifacts, which, bear with me, if we were on video, which you don't want, trust me, if we were on video, this would be a little bit easier. But now if you use Claude to produce some sort of an artifact, like a bunch of code, it shows the chat on the left-hand side of your screen, and it shows the artifact in a window on the right-hand side of the screen. And I can put a link into the show notes of where Anthropic describes this. It is shockingly useful. That doesn't sound like a big deal, right? Because you could just scroll back and forth and, it's really not producing anything new. It's just a change in the interface. But it is much, much more useful to be able to see the artifact and the chat at the same time than to have to scroll around as you're doing this iterative development, which is what chatbot interfaces are so good at. So if you haven't checked that out, check that out. It does it automatically. So if you're just in a chat, hey, what does this term mean, or that kind of thing, you may not see it pop up. But if you're actually producing some artifact, some outcome that you might take and copy and paste somewhere, it will usually pop up that artifact window. And I think that's pretty cool. So if you haven't checked it out, you should. The other thing that they introduced was projects. So there's a thing called retrieval augmented generation, RAG, that's a big deal in the generative AI space. And what RAG does, kind of in a nutshell, it allows using specific resources to answer questions or to produce things in your chat session or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So, for example, when you go and ask it to check a website, like ChatGPT to check a website, it's retrieving something and it's using that information to generate its answer. Well, what you can do with projects in Claude is you can do things like uploading multiple documents. You've been able to do kind of attachments. You upload an image and it'll, like Rob, you just mentioned, it'll generate something. But now you can have a bunch of those. You can also give it custom instructions to use just for that project. So it's not like ChatGPT's custom instructions where it's across all of your chats. And you don't have to copy and paste. If you don't want something in your custom instructions, you don't want to have to you have to copy and paste them into every new chat session that you do on that project. Now you put it into the project. And I've just started to play around with it because it just came out. But I have the feeling that this is going to be significant as well. Like you could take a bunch of your marketing documents to maybe different constituencies and put them in and ask questions about those marketing documents. Where do these differ? Do we have inconsistencies in our messaging that we don't want to have? You can take a bunch of academic articles, put them in, and I played with this. And said, okay, I want you to identify all of the theories that are used in these articles. Identify all the constructs. I even had it create a construct table. So list all of the constructs out in the rows, or papers in the rows, all of the constructs in the columns, and put an X in any paper that uses that construct. Construct is just a concept, by the way. Sorry, we went into geek speak there for a second. But that's a huge thing to be able to do. Now, I haven't tested its accuracy or any of that sort of thing yet, but it produced what looked okay to me for the limited testing that I did.
Craig, what I think will be really interesting, whether that's with academic articles or, I'm even thinking of like, let's say you're doing a market analysis of something in a marketing class. If you can load pages and pages of data into this sort of a space and then start asking it questions, and it can assimilate in very fast ways of something that normally would take, let's say, I was teaching a doctoral seminar where I was asking students to do this sort of thing. That might be a semester long project that they've created within a week. Probably
Yeah.
within a few hours of playing it and playing with it and asking it the right questions. So definitely is going to change the human component of what's necessary in this space.
Well, our colleague that I mentioned earlier, Franz Belanger, who has a very widely referenced paper on privacy with Rob. This is for the audience. Franz told me once that she never wanted to code another study. So going through and creating these codes is kind of the drudgery work that's got to be done so you can do the really important stuff. And all jobs have that kind of thing, not just, research jobs. And so I think you're right, Rob, being able to take these documents and make them as the foundation for something you're trying to do with AI is going to be huge. By the way, if you haven't checked out Google's Notebook LM, it's worth checking out because it allows some of the same thing, but I think at a larger scale. I'm just starting to play around with that, but that's really worth checking out. You may have to go through some things to like enable experimental features in your Google account, but you can just ask Gemini or Google how to set up Notebook LM, and it's not that hard to do. But I think these kinds of tools, the bigger message is these kinds of tools are going to continue to emerge, and it's going to allow us to rethink how we do our jobs.
Absolutely agree.
So I think it's going to be worth keeping an eye on these tools because they're going to fundamentally change kind of how we do a number of different jobs. So our final topic, Rob, you sent me an article from The Verge. I'm going to read the title. It's Microsoft's AI boss thinks it's perfectly okay to steal content if it's on the open web. Slash Mustafa Suleiman, and I'm no idea if I said that correctly, has a curious understanding of copyright law on the web. I love the title because it automatically tells you the bias that the article is going to have. So, Rob, why did you send this to me and say that we ought to discuss it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when it comes to the ethical conversation around generative AI. So copyright law would say that just because something is on the internet, just because you can find it on the internet, does not make it freeware, does not make it something that anyone can just have and call their own. So there's this established copyright law that says that's not true. But many of the generative AI tools, and I believe this one was talking about Microsoft's relationship with OpenAI, is basically saying if I can go out on the internet and I can crawl the information, that they can use it to seed and to train that generative AI tool. So this is a violation of copyright law, at least as The Verge wrote about it. I'm not a legal expert, so I'm going to put that caveat out there. And it made me wonder, what are the ramifications for people who use the tools that are trained off of, I'm going to call it stolen information. And so let's say I'm an artist and I create a piece of art as a student, as a person out in the world, and it is based on art that is protected by copyright, and I did it through prompts and whatever generative AI tool I'm using, but they didn't have permission to be based on that. Do I have implications as the user of that data? OpenAI made it available to me, ChatGPT, whatever it was. I did something using information that was a violation of copyright law. Do I carry any of that burden as the consumer using that tool?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And sticking with our mantra, who knows? I mean, I think literally nobody knows at this point, until that kind of thing goes through the court and gets decided. My hope is that there will be behind the scenes negotiations like we're already hearing about that will kind of work this out. That's my hope. But again, who knows? I mean, that might happen, that might not happen. They are not, would be my guess. But but maybe. I mean, maybe they will. Um, yeah. And so for the audience to kind of fully understand this, the robot.txt, my understanding is it was an agreed upon practice. It is not codified in law. So it's just something that, kind of there was this, I don't even want to say rule, but just this practice that the people who were, or the Googles of the world and the Yahoos of the world were just, okay, we will respect that. And Microsoft, OpenAI, and some of the other generative AI producers are not respecting that.
Well, this begs the question a little bit, Craig, for policy and legal aspects of things. And one of the things that, at least in the United States, where I'm most familiar, but I think this is fairly pervasive throughout the world, is it takes a long time to create policy. That politicians are not quick, especially when it comes to dealing with technologies. And the technologies are moving so fast that by the time a policy is created, is it up to date? And what's that cycle time look like to actually be able to, from a government perspective, guide this conversation and protect those who need protecting from the ever-changing technological beast that's out there.
Yeah. I mean, we're still seeing that with internet regulations, that are always a little bit out of date.
Well, in the cybersecurity class I teach, Craig, we touch on this a bit. And one of the challenges I have for my students is that they're young and they understand this perhaps better than some of the politicians that are making these regulations. And this is the sort of space where they can go out and change the world. They can, probably have a voice in the potential policy changes that need to happen to not harness and hold back what's possible, but to at least protect creators in this space and in ways that I think would be very good for society.
Yeah, yep. I think that is at least a non-zero possibility. I wonder why the AI companies don't just respect the robot.txt. Are they really going to lose that much quality if they did?
That's a good question. And one of the fears I have as I think about this is, at what point do people stop putting their original creations into the internet? And what does this, unintended consequences of this really good technology have on the creation and sharing of individuals' stuff?
Yeah. I mean, is that going to lead to more things being very heavily paywalled, in ways that the crawlers can't get around? Who knows? I think for our audience, though, we want to see if we can give some practical advice on this. And you may disagree. My general take is I'm not going to worry about it just yet, because the likelihood of me doing anything that's going to draw attention is pretty low. Now, if I was, making T-shirts and selling them, if I was trying to use AI to write books, I might want to be a little bit more careful. But with the kind of work that I think most of us are going to do in higher ed, I'm not too worried about it legally or ethically, because I'm not trying to reproduce, anything that's been copyrighted. And it's so one of the things about responsibility is you have to have reasonable knowledge that something, excuse me, that something you did is going to lead to or could lead to some consequence. And I think there are so many layers in between what's going on with the training data and what we might produce that I don't feel very responsible if there's some ethical issues there.
I think that's true from a lot of what we do as information systems educators. But I do think if you're talking about, other aspects of, let's say you're in a marketing class and you're trying to create a new logo for something, that's part of a project that you're maybe even working with a client. And if you're seeding Dolly with prompts that get it to create a new logo based on other people's logos or based on stuff that's copyrighted. Thinking that through and making sure that that is not an infringement is important, right? So I could see, depending on what you're creating, there might be good conversations to have. And the thing I would challenge faculty to do is have these conversations in the context of your class with your students. It is a little bit the wild, wild west, but in that, there's a great opportunity to be critical, to analyze, to assess what's going on, and to figure out in the context of what you're doing, what is acceptable and what is ethical.
No, that's an excellent point, helping students become aware of this. And I would add to that this is another reason that you should use generative AI to help you do your work, but not to do your work for you. So if you take Dolly and create a logo, but then you take that logo and you give it to a graphic artist, or you do some work and tweak it and kind of adjust some things, maybe that makes it better. Because where I get confused about all of this, if I look at 1,000 logos before I create my own has little elements of a lot of those 1,000 logos in it. And so where is that line? Well, I think if you just say, hey, Dolly, create this logo, and then you use that as your logo, that's not the same as if you just use that to influence what you ultimately came up with. And I think that gives you some ethical and potentially legal distance that might work to your advantage, and you're probably going to end up with a better product anyway. I mean, like Rob has been very proudly holding up the very first AI Goes to College coffee mug, and I know you can't see it, but that our cover art was definitely influenced by AI, but somebody took kind of what maybe they started out with Dolly or whatever, and then made changes to it and adapted it and adjusted it to where it doesn't look like something Dolly came up with. So I think that's kind of what we can help students understand. And for those of you who are at, in marketing and communications at universities, you need to be thinking about this as well. That's where it gets really bad, is if you expose your university, your institution, to some kind of legal ramifications. That's bad. That's really, really bad. So you do not want. Yes, because it will, that meeting will probably have somebody from HR in it, which is not something you want either. All right, Rob, I think it's about time to wrap. Any last thoughts before we move on?
Last thought, I would say, just kind of in summary of where we're at, and it seems like a theme we've touched on a number of times, is explore and enjoy the creation process and learning what this is, but keep a critical eye towards what you're doing.
Yep. That's right. Remember, you are ultimately responsible for anything you put out there in the world, including this episode. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and we will be out in another couple of weeks with the next episode of AI Goes to College. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for listening to AI Goes to College. If you found this episode useful, you'll love the AI Goes to College newsletter. Each edition brings you useful tips, news, and insights that you can use to help you figure out what in the world is going on with generative AI and how it's affecting higher ed. Just go to aigoestocollege.com to sign up. I won't try to sell you anything, and I won't spam you or share your information with anybody else. As an incentive for subscribing, I'll send you the Getting Started with Generative AI guide. Even if you're an expert with AI, you'll find the guide useful for helping your less knowledgeable colleagues.